Joining us now, Ben Tribbett, the editor of the website, NotLarrySabato.com. He's also going to be with me on election night. Great to have you with us, Ben.
Good morning.
Now, Ben, sparks flying in the lieutenant governor's race now just, 8 days away. And why don't we start with your analysis? You came out with a piece the other day that I have a little trouble understanding, but I'm going to give you the first word on it. You said that debate Sunday for brunch in Springfield that Ralph Northam said, and you quote on your website, that he was open, quote unquote, to power sharing, quote unquote, with Senate Republicans if he was elected, if they play fairly. And then went on to say that this is a new development. Explain.
Well, we've obviously had in the last 20 years two different times where the Senate was tied 20-20. The first, there was a Democratic lieutenant governor in the 1990s. The second was 2 years ago when there was a Republican lieutenant governor. The first time when there was a Democratic lieutenant governor, there was a power sharing agreement where both sides agreed for the next 4 years to share power in the Senate, because the Senate was equally divided. This year, when it happened, or 2 years ago when it happened, the Republicans decided to use the lieutenant governor to take total control of the Senate, which is to say, even though there were 20 senators on each side, they would take control of each committee and be able to move legislation through without power sharing. What Senator Northam is essentially saying this weekend is he's open to having a power sharing agreement with the Republicans if he's elected lieutenant governor. From anyone who's ever done negotiations before in this type of situation, making that type of statement this early, even if the Senate Democratic caucus is agreeing that there should be power sharing or wants to go back to it, puts him in an incredibly weak position. And it just shows that he just has no idea of how to negotiate or how to handle a situation like this.
Okay, I see where you're coming from. However, I do have to point out, Ben, and I'm going to get your response on this, that it seems from reading everything that you may have taken some of this stuff a little bit out of context, because when I got the transcript today to prepare for our show, let me read you what Ralph actually said at this debate. He said, quote unquote, the first thing the lieutenant governor needs to do as a Democrat would be to put the committees back in charge of Democrats, okay, which is the opposite of what you're saying, so we can push forward our principles and values. Now, there's been some talk, will the Democrats do some power sharing? And he said the answer to that is no, we won't. That's not a positive, that's a negative. He says, no, we won't until they play fair. And when asked to define play fair, he said they would have to repeal the ultrasound bill, the trap laws, the personhood bill, discrimination against GLBT, voter suppression. I mean, he listed a laundry list of things that the Republican Senate is not going to do. So de facto, he's not going to power share, and so is not
well, John,
your comment
not exactly. Not exactly, and I'll tell you, I know that they've been pushing this transcript around, trying to downplay it because it's hurting the campaign. But what I saw this weekend at the debate was this was actually not even a question that came up. There was no follow-up question that on that second part of the answer. There was no question about this. This was something that Ralph just brought up. I believe it was in the opening statement or in the first question. But if it was in the first question, it was unrelated to the question. And this was something that just came off of the top of Ralph's head while he was talking. So this was not something that was specifically asked. And the audience had a reaction to it. I mean, you could see people in the audience sort of looking around, not sure how to respond to this new development happening right in front of their eyes at a debate, because no one had heard either of the candidates say this the entire campaign, and it's sort of being sprung on voters a week out.
Okay, but the Washington Post covered the event, and they never brought it up. Why?
I don't know. Actually, I was sitting right next to Erin Wack, and she and I were talking about it at the event. An editor could have taken it out, but I know that she noticed it at the event because we were discussing it. We were sitting in the press area together, And, there have been a number of people who attended the event who have been talking about it. I think that, John, right before you get into an election like this, there is a lot of people who have already made their mind up, and that will go on and defend almost anything a candidate will say. Now, I think that Senator Northam's position is a legitimate position, that he could break the tie in favor of a power-sharing agreement like the Democrats did in 1995. I don't think it's a legitimate position to claim that he didn't bring this up, that he didn't say he was open to it. And again, this is about negotiation. That's what I told you when you initially asked me about it. It's about the position you start from. And so Senator Northam putting some conditions on it at this point is not really the news. The news is that he's open to it, and he's sending a signal to the Republican senators that that's where the negotiations can begin.
Well, that's a little bit of a stretch, though, because he qualified his open to it statement by putting forth a laundry list of policy moves that he knows Republicans wouldn't make. So, I mean, I'm not sure. That's like my son asking me if he can do something, and I put 10 conditions on it that make it impossible for him to do. So I'm not sure that where you're coming from is reality. The other thing I do have to say, I've had Senator Northam on my show several times during this campaign. We got the transcript back from earlier. I asked him point blank about power sharing, as I've asked many Democratic state senators, including John Miller and others, and basically said if he's elected lieutenant governor that he wouldn't do a power share because Bill Bolling and the Republicans now set the new precedent. So now that would be a change from what he said on my show just a few months ago. So I'm not seeing where it adds up, Ben, in all reality.
Well, John, as you said, the transcript is being sent around, and I'll just quote exactly what he says at the end of the statement. You do that by working together. Until we get some cooperation from the other side of the aisle, Democrats will take control of the Senate, and that's the way we'll be until they play fairly. And what Ralph is saying is he's open to a power share if they will play fairly. And as you noted, he had a laundry list of things that he'd like to see done, but that's where he's starting the negotiations. And remember, too, that you're dealing with 20 Democratic senators, so this is really the 20 senators and the lieutenant governor. You're either going to have the caucus come together behind the lieutenant governor to negotiate something like this, or it's going to be up to the weakest link, whoever wants to negotiate first. And so you didn't hear Republican senators going into this last session throwing out the idea of power sharing before they took the Senate completely. They were all on the same message of we will not power share. And so when you open the door to it, what you're really doing is weakening your negotiation position, in my opinion, and that's why I wrote about it, why I thought it was very newsworthy.
This is the John Fredericks Show. We're with Ben Tribbett. He's the author of Not Larry Sabato. Great website, by the way. I do read Ben every day. Great writer, very entertaining. Let me ask you this, Ben. Who cares?
Well, John, I think that, going into this primary, people have to decide what kind of lieutenant governor they're looking for. Now, I was also at a debate on Saturday. There were these debates happening back to back. And what I saw on Saturday was also very newsworthy in the lieutenant governor's race, in that Ralph Northam was essentially denying that the party switching incident from 2009 ever happened, that he ever considered a change of parties. He called Julian Walker, when the Virginian pilot was quoted, an article that said he did do it, a liar at the debate. I was pretty incredulous in the back of the room watching the debate because I reported on this incident when it happened as well. And I was sitting in the room and listening to Ralph deny it ever happened. And so, I think we're at that point in a primary where the candidates feel like they have to say things to get elected. For me, that was enough to decide how I was going to vote, because I'm not going to vote for someone who is going to, go on a line about, Julian Walker's a liar and Rachel Maddow's a liar for reporting on it. And I guess he didn't say I was a liar. No one asked about me, but I guess I am for reporting on it. And, we're in the silly point of the primary. And I think the stakes are especially high because the Republicans have nominated E.W. Jackson, And both of these candidates are thinking if they can find any way to cobble the votes together to get nominated, they're going to be the next lieutenant governor.
Well, let me ask you this, Ben, straight up. Now, you have endorsed Anish Chopra, right?
Correct.
So then, is it fair to say that some of what you are going to be reporting on is tainted by the fact that you've already staked out a position?
Well, I mean, bloggers endorse candidates all the time, and I generally endorse candidates a lot earlier in the process than this. I actually had written a piece last week announcing I was not going to make an endorsement.
Right.
And until I went to the debate on Saturday and heard what Senator Northam was saying, that he had never attempted to switch parties or support the Republicans on reorganization, I was going to be neutral. So I think, voters like me will be watching this thing, watching the developments in the last week, and I think the last public polling said that over 50% of the voters in this race were going to be undecided with 2 weeks to go.
Right.
So both candidates have to figure out how to reach these voters, and that personally was enough for me, though.
Well, now there's about only 8 days to go. So if you look at this race, Ben, right now, and you go back to what you just said about Senator Northam when he did meet with Republicans and talked about caucusing with them. Well, one thing that we do know for a fact is that the Republicans approached him. It's not like he picked up the phone and called Tommy Norman and asked him to meet him at Starbucks. So, he was contacted by the Senate Republicans in Virginia, and he had a dialogue with them. What's the matter with that? It's not like he was covertly out there, trying to gain something for himself. They went to him, and he had a dialogue. Why is that bad?
The reality was that when that occurred, Ralph Northam essentially shut down the Virginia Senate for an entire day. Tommy Norman filed a reorganization motion at the start of the day. The Senate was adjourned so the Democrats could go into caucus and find out what was going on. Northam told the other Democratic senators he was going to support it. They spent hours in caucus trying to talk him out of it unsuccessfully. He was then called to an unscheduled meeting with then-Governor Kane, who pledged to restore some of the funding he was concerned about, and he decided to remain a Democrat. Over the course of the day, the Senate was out of business, couldn't get anything done. No one knew who was in control. And that's the kind of political rookie move that I think a lot of people would be concerned about with a lieutenant governor who had even more leadership responsibilities. Now, I will say this. I thought Senator Northam's answer to this earlier in the campaign was excellent. He essentially said, yes, it occurred. I learned from it. I made some mistakes, and I learned from it going forward, which I think is the best answer, to acknowledge it happened and say that he learned from some of the problems that occurred because of it.
The other thing is that, you can't be duplicitous here, because you just said that, well, it shows poor negotiation skill as far as the, power share if fair play. On the other hand, Senate Republicans went to him, and rather than blow them off, he entertained the dialogue and then went back to Governor Kane and said, hey, I need this funding that is important to me in my district reinstated in order for me to stay where I am. So actually that's outstanding negotiation. So, Ben, you can't have it both ways.
Well, I think I would disagree that's outstanding negotiation. I think when you're in a Senate that's 20-20 and you're playing games like that, what it eventually leads to is anarchy, because every member can do it. And so you can't have one member doing that, or you will constantly have the Senate shut down by one member, and it turns into Richmond turns into Washington.
Now, what about the fact that if the Democrats nominate Anish Chopra, and I've already predicted this is going to be a pretty significant win, I think, for Senator Herring. That's just my view, out of Leesburg. Well, then the Democrats would have an all-Northern Virginia ticket. Don't you find that problematic?
I think the Democrats are really stuck on this primary of a problem either way, because they're either going to nominate an all-Northern Virginia ticket, which is a huge problem downstate, or they're going to nominate a ticket of 3 white guys, which doesn't represent the diversity of the party at all and the type of voters that Democrats need to be turning out that don't usually vote in off-year elections. So I think it's going to be a huge problem for the Democrats, but it's look, they didn't recruit any women to run this year. The only minorities running are Anish Chopra and Justin Fairfax, and as you noted, I don't think Justin Fairfax will win.
No, exactly.
So that's just the position they're in.
So do you believe that people are still going to make voting decisions based on the candidate's gender or race?
Oh, yeah. In primaries, identity politics is huge. In the last 3 state Democratic primaries we had, there's a extreme correlation, especially downstate, to the racial composition of the voters in a precinct to how they vote, depending on who's on the ballot. And so I think you will see a lot of splits like that, especially in the Attorney General's race. It may not be as evident in the Lieutenant Governor's race because Anish Chopra's obviously not African American. He's just he's a minority, but he's not African American. So we don't know. We have no history to judge that against. But African American candidates generally win in excess of 80% of the vote in any majority-minority precinct, and usually get less than 35% of the vote in any majority-white precinct. That's historically speaking over the last 20 years in Democratic primaries.
So do you think that's going to play out in the general? And if so, would that help E.W. Jackson, who under any scenario is going to be the only black candidate in this race?
It could, Cuccinelli especially has been doing a lot of outreach to the evangelical part of the African American community, and E.W. Jackson will fit in to that strategy. He could overperform in some neighborhoods. I don't know how large he will overperform, and it will probably be offset by big losses in the suburbs. But E.W. Jackson is an interesting candidate biographically to being able to win votes. It's just that his statements are so harsh, especially against the president.
They're off the charts. Look, E.W. Jackson isn't going to get elected lieutenant governor when these statements start to come out. Hey, Ben, we're out of time. We're going to see you next week, and we're going to see you Tuesday night for our big election night. This is the John Fredericks Show.